All right, for this week's bonus video, we're going to look at the top 5 trainer cards I'd love to see reprinted. Now, to be clear and to be frank, I don't expect all 5 of them to be reprinted. I think that would probably be not a good idea, but some combination of maybe 2 or 3 of them would be really interesting for the format. Maybe even 1 or 2 of them might be very good for the format right now. But yeah. Also, I should also point out while we're observing this, before we begin, some of these choices are going to be divisive. I know a couple cards in this list in particular that will probably rub people the wrong way, but I really like the card and I think it's actually good for the format, even though that's not necessarily a popular opinion for one of these cards in particular. So not every player is going to like every card or every playstyle. That's fine. If you have a difference of opinion or other ideas for your cards you'd rather see reprinted, share them in the comments. But please do be respectful. Remember, just because one person likes a card, you don't have to like that card. So that's fine. That said, so let's look at a couple honorable mentions real quick. So either Oracle or Mallow is my first honorable mention. So this allows you to look at the top 2 cards, or not look at the top 2 cards. Look at your deck, and you basically pick the cards that you want at the top of the deck. So this is the original wording for Oracle. This is the original wording for Mallow. Mallow's not that old of a card, so we're just going to steal Mallow's wording for a brand new print of Oracle, and we'll pretend this is currently in standard format. This would be a really interesting card for Gardevoir players to kind of manipulate their top decks, to decide which cards they want on top. If you played during the Sun and Moon Lost Thunder era, or any format in that era with Zoroark GX, you're very familiar with this effect, because Zoroark loved Mallow, made sure to arrange the top of its deck to draw the cards that it wanted. This could be really good for Gardevoir in particular, because Gardevoir is very vulnerable to inconsistency, and something like Mallow or Oracle could be a little bit of a boon. Now, don't get me wrong, Gardevoir is an extremely strong deck, doesn't necessarily need this effect, but it would be very interesting to run as like a 1 or 2 of in a Guardy list. Next up is Cessation Crystal. Now you can see this is a little bit older of a card, and doesn't necessarily apply to current game mechanics. So I'm just going to go straight to the newer version of this card with simplified texts for the current way the game is played. So this is the Cessation Crystal version that would be potentially introduced into current standard. It says if the Pokemon this card is attached to doesn't have a rule box and is in the active spot, each player's Pokemon in play in each player's hand and in each player's discard pile has no abilities. So this is a very interesting way to kind of force people's hands with regard to abilities, right? So this is a little bit stronger than Klefki, but at the same time, it can still be roped out. It can be blowered away with a Lost Vacuum. So it's counterable, but it also requires some counterplay from the opponent, which I think is very interesting. We need a little bit more counterplay, and abilities are still running pretty rampant, even with things like Klefki, even with things like Path to Peak. So something like Cessation Crystal is that one extra step of, okay, maybe you need to actually try to earn those abilities instead of just burning through everything. Maybe a little less flower selecting, a little less refinement, a little more Lost Vacuum. All right, now that we've looked at those honorable mentions, I think both of those are pretty interesting honorable mentions. They just didn't quite make the top 5. We're going to look at the first card on the list, Sky Pillar. Sky Pillar is a card from Celestial Storm that says, prevent all effects of the opponent's attacks, including damage, done to benched Pokemon, both yours and your opponent's. We don't really need to modernize that wording very much. That is quite in line with how they would word a card today. So prevent all effects of the opponent's Pokemon's attacks, including damage, done to benched Pokemon. So this would shield you from Sableye attacks. This would prevent bench sniping. So this is kind of a Manaphy in a way, but it's also a way to shield you from the dropped damage counters that Sableye would do and destroy your board with. Now, this is obviously quite counterable. Lost Vacuum exists. They could just bump it with another stadium, but this is yet another way for decks that are super vulnerable to Sableye to try to have some sort of counterplay to Sableye, to that Lost Box archetype. Maybe it's not enough. Could probably be argued that it isn't enough. It is very easily countered, but it is something else, right? If you can get the Lost Box player to burn all their stadiums or burn their Lost Vacuum, Sky Pillar is something that could potentially prevent them from taking game against you with Sableye. So it's an interesting idea. So definitely something worth considering for bringing back. Next up is Desert Ruins. So the original wording for this card is, at any time between turns, each player puts 1 damage counter on his or her Pokemon X with a maximum HP of at least 100. Now, That's just everything in current standard. So we're going to update that text. Desert Ruin says, during Pokemon checkup, put 2 damage counters on each Pokemon with the rule box with a maximum HP of 200 or more, both yours and your opponent's. Pokemon X, Pokemon V, etc. have rule boxes. So, Desert Ruins. In a way, this is sort of like a spiritual reprint of Shrine of Punishment. However, Shrine of Punishment is also, in a way, a spiritual reprint of the original Desert Ruins. But the good thing about this particular card is that it doesn't punish lower HP rule boxers, right? It doesn't punish something like an expanded Tapu Koko Prism Star, or even in standard, something like a Radiant Greninja. But it does punish these basic Pokemon V. It does punish these big Pokemon X that have, 340 HP. And it forces them to have a counterplay. It forces them to have the Lost Vacuum or to have a counter stadium. And at the same time, it pushes single prizer decks a little bit further into the spotlight, right? Something like, if it could ever find the means of being consistent, United Wings, or a fully single prizer version of Lost Box would really love Desert Ruins as a counter card, for example, to the stadium we just looked at. And why not? Like, why not have a little bit of extra spread damage in the format, right? If you're a deck that's extremely heavy on rule box Pokemon, whether that's Mew or maybe that's even Ting Lu, right? Desert Ruins is your enemy, and you'll have to actually play against it. You'll have a little bit of something. Now, this card also allows you to interact with cards that could be printed as Pokemon, something like the Tapu Lele that spreads or rearranges rather damage counters, so that you can take knockouts in a very fun fashion, right? You can wait for the Desert Ruins damage to rack up. Maybe your opponent can't quite get rid of the Desert Ruins fast enough and you're running 4 of them, so you just keep hitting them over and over and over again with these damage counters. But it's not enough for any one specific knockout, but you can rearrange all the damage counters that have piled up on their side and take a couple of knockouts and get 4 prizes off it, right? Great little plays that can be made with cards like these. I love cards like these, and Shrine of Punishment was amazing in its day, and I expect that if this card were to be introduced in the standard format, this one would also be quite fun. Now, this is one of the potentially very controversial picks. This is Counter Catcher or POW Hand Extension. So Counter Catcher is half of POW. So we're going to look at Counter Catcher real quick, and then we're going to look at the other half of that effect with regards to POW Hand Extension. So either one of these could be pretty interesting. I kind of lean toward POW just because it's more flexible, but this card is extraordinarily strong. And with a card like Irida in format, it might, or even Arven in format, it might just be that little oomph that certain decks need to keep themselves in play. So this is, you can only play this card if you have more prize cards remaining than your opponent, so you do need to be behind on prize cards. Switch one of your opponent's benched Pokemon with their active Pokemon. So in more modern terms, we can look at POW. This is POW. This is the very wordy version. This is back when they were trying to make battles possible where you could do 2v2. We're going to go past that. We're going to go straight to more modern wording without the multi-battles. Okay, so choose one. Move an energy from your opponent's active Pokemon to one of their bench Pokemon. So you have the option of moving an energy from their active, maybe stranding an energy somewhere where they really don't want or need it, or switch in one of your opponent's bench Pokemon to the active spot. So you have that option, right? Maybe gusting isn't what your deck needs. Maybe you don't really care about gusting the opponent's Pokemon, but switching an energy to one of their other Pokemon really hurts them. Maybe this is something you do right before you hit them with a Giacomo, for example. So maybe they have 2 Fusion Strike energies on an Ice Cube or a Meloetta, and another Fusion Strike energy on one of their Genesects. So you can hit them with a POW, move one of the Fusion Strike energies off of that Ice Cube and onto one of their other Pokemon, and then hit them with Giacomo and just knock out all 3, right? That opens little plays like that. And at the same time, if you're behind on prize cards, you do still have that gusting option. So something like POW is just really interesting for the standard format. And because of how flexible it is, also offers some interesting options for control archetypes. I like. Now, POW, a little controversial. Now for a very controversial pick, Versus Seeker. I have talked about this card on Twitter before, how I would love to see it come back. I understand people's hesitation for it. I understand that PalPad exists. I would also point out that PalPad existed when the currently pictured print of Versus Seeker was in Standard last. That doesn't seem to really matter to the developers of the game. I think that's fine. So put a supporter card from your discard pile into your hand. Now, this card did exist in the original EX era, which is very much what the developers seem to be kind of echoing, right? They're not doing a one-for-one copy, but they are kind of taking inspiration from the original EX era. This card did exist during that time frame, so it is possible that we could see it. And it would be really nice even to see a card like this in Obsidian Flames, where at least what we've seen of this set so far has been, let's say, underwhelming. Not quite on the level of Pokemon card 151, but pretty underwhelming all the same, right? It's not quite as inspiring as, say, what we've seen or what we got out of Poly Evolved. But Versus Seeker, the reason I am a champion for Versus Seeker. Now, I like the variety of supporter cards that a card like this encourages, right? In current standard, if you're throwing a one of supporter card in your hand in your deck, you're doing it because you desperately need that card like once. But Versus Seeker allows you to be a little bit more creative with your supporter choices. So maybe you throw in 2 researches, an Avery, a Giacomo, a boss, and you're not quite having as many of each of those supporter cards. So you are very reliant on having your Versus Seeker for those. But at the same time, because you have a variety of support cards, you have a variety of options available to you throughout the game. Now, Versus Seeker, yes, does make getting something like a boss's orders pretty trivial at large parts of the game. But at the same time, it also means that counterplays are also available to you. Things like Avery or Iono are available to you all throughout the game because of a card like this, right? If you have a supporter in the discard pile, maybe you had to discard it turn 1 because you had to Ultra Ball for a mana fee or whatever, right? Versus Seeker opens up those options, gives you a choice in how you play those supporter cards, even if you have to get rid of them early. And like I said, I appreciate the variety of supporter cards that could see play with Versus Seeker. Now, the flip side to that is maybe there's just no variety. Maybe it all stays, 4 research, 4 boss, or 4 research, 4 Iono, 2 boss, and nobody ever plays any other supporter combo. Or maybe Lost Box is just like, 4 Colress, 4 Versus Seeker, busted. And yeah, it is pretty busted. But at the same time, I do think the variety is quite welcome. So Versus Seeker, I do think it's a great option. Yes, controversial, but I think it'd be very interesting in the standard format. However, it is not my number 1 pick. Believe it or not. Look, a little modernized version with older art, just kind of spice it up a little bit. There's the Versus Seeker with fancier art. And my number 1 pick is Pokemon Communication. Now, as much as I love Versus Seeker, there was definitely a absence felt when Evolution Incense left the format. But I'd rather not see Evolution Incense back. I would rather see Pokemon Communication. We last saw Pokemon Communication in this print. This is the team up print. But I would like to see it back. Because unlike Evolution Incense, where you just quickly go get an evolution Pokemon, put it in your hand, Pokemon Communication requires you to have another Pokemon in your hand to search for a Pokemon, right? So it's a little bit more flexible in that you can get any Pokemon, but you also have to have a different Pokemon in your hand in order to do that. Which is just good all around, I think. It allows you to grab stuff like Ominion if you need it, but at the same time, you could grab maybe your Gardevoir X, right? You maybe need your Gardevoir, or maybe you need, your Ting Lu for setting up, or your Squawkabilly, or whatever card it happens to be, right? Pokemon Communication is that one card that will allow you to grab what you want as you need it. And this is great because a lot of decks right now are pretty heavy on Pokemon. Something like, Gardevoir may be running 18-ish Pokemon, and it's not uncommon to see decks with really high counts of Pokemon right now because there's just so much utility in all those Pokemon. And so something like Pokemon Communication would see a decent amount of play in those decks because it's very flexible. Now, I've also heard recently from players that Ultra Ball is just kind of painful at the moment for a lot of decks, or at least for too many decks, right? So having an option that's not Ultra Ball to allow you to still search for Pokemon, or any Pokemon, could be really good. Right, maybe as a Lost Box player, you just don't really want to run that one of Ultra Ball in whatever list you're playing. Maybe a one of Pokemon Communication could be better in its place. Maybe not, but it's an option, right? It's something you could use. Would decks like Gardevoir love this? You bet they would. Would Lugia like this to find its Archeops? Yeah, probably. But every deck would benefit from something like a Pokemon Communication reprint. I can talk, I swear. So I do think this is my number 1 pick for what I would like to see reprinted. So if I had to pick just 2, I might actually just pick Pokemon Communication and Desert Ruins. But I could also see myself leaning toward Pokemon Communication and Versus Seeker. So both cards pretty interesting. I honestly think all 7 cards on this list are very interesting, right? Any of them could be great, made to come back in the standard format. But yeah, I don't design the cards. I don't pick what cards come out in the sets. So we'll just have to wait and see what the developers have decided comes out in the next reprints. They love reprinting stuff, so I'm sure we'll get more reprints. Maybe we'll just get an Escape Rope and they'll call it a day. And Escape Rope won't leave the format because woohoo, we have Escape Rope back. Maybe we'll actually get Pokemon Communication. Who knows? That said, I do hope you enjoyed this little video here. Again, here's a little updated Pokemon Communication. Just got the silver border. Same text, already existing art. This is a promo art, but it's good stuff. I hope you enjoyed this little video. I would be very curious. What are your choices? What would you like to see come back to the standard format? Maybe you like one of the cards on my list and you're like, yeah, you know what? That card sounds great. Or maybe you're like, no, all your cards are wrong. I would rather have this card instead. What is that card that you would rather have? Let me know in the comments. I will see you in the next video.